have you all heard about Roger the kangaroo? Well, Roger the kangaroo has gained fame because of his muscular build. Now, where can we find such a beautiful creature? Roger the kangaroo gained fame for his muscular build and can be found on the smallest continent of the world, that is Australia. Now, though Australia is the smallest continent of the world, it has a beautiful landscape and is famous for its unique flora, fauna and varied biodiversity. So let's spare some time to admire the biodiversity and unique landscape of Australia. Australia has one of the most beautiful landscapes on Earth, from snow-capped peaks of Australian Alps to rich coral reefs, tropical rainforests and sandy deserts. It is known for iconic monuments and has unique animals like the koala bears, the platypus and the kangaroos that are not found elsewhere. Now let's see how this small continent came into existence. Well, if you remember, 2 million years ago, the Pangaea or the supercontinent broke up or fragmented into different land masses, and that eventually became the continents as we see them today. A similar thing happened to Australia. Australia got separated from the Gondwana landmass. So, it is the Carboniferous period where the Pangaea started breaking up or fragmenting into different land masses. So, Pangaea first broke up into two major landforms, that is Laurasia, that existed in the northern hemisphere, and Gondwana, that existed in the southern hemisphere. Now, in the Jurassic period, that is around 180 million years ago, the western part of Gondwana, including Africa and South America, got separated from the eastern part that included Australia, India, Madagascar and Antarctica. Now, eventually, they got separated, and on further fragmentation, they finally now exist as we see them today. This is how Australia got separated from the Gondwana landmass and now exists as the smallest continent on Earth. But the question that arises now is that who exactly discovered the continent of Australia, or how did it come into recognition in the entire world? So, it is believed that the Dutch navigators in the early 17th century, that is in 1644 to be very approximate, discovered the northern, western and southern coast of the continent. So, the northern, western and southern coast of the continent were discovered by the Dutch navigators, who then named the continent as New Holland. So, the continent of Australia initially was not called Australia, but it was called New Holland by the Dutch navigators. However, the discovery of Australia is attributed to Captain James Cook. So, it is Captain James Cook who made several voyages in the Pacific Ocean, which included the first voyage by Endeavour, that is a British naval research vessel, followed by 2 voyages made by the Resolution, that is another British vessel, in which he made the second and the third voyage and finally discovered the continent of Australia. So, in all these voyages, he reached the southern portion of the continent, that is the southern part of New South Wales, and then moved upwards along the eastern coastline of the continent, where he entered the continent of Australia and claimed it as a part of the British Dominion. So, it is on 22nd August 1770 that Australia was discovered. After the discovery of Australia by Captain James Cook, there were many European settlers who rushed to the continent of Australia because the continent was home to one of the most important mineral resource, that is gold. So, gold, when it was discovered in Australia, led to massive gold rush immigration in the continent. So, the gold rush immigration was seen in the early 1850s by the European settlers who came to try their fortune in the country by gold mining. So there were voluntary European settlers who came to the continent to try their luck or to try their fortune by gold mining. So this newly discovered continent already became world famous because of its natural resource and unique landscape. After many years, a federation of 6 colonies was formed in which the Commonwealth of Australia was established as a dominion of British. That means that Australia was taken a part of the British Empire. However, in 1986, in this year, the Australian Act 2 ended all the constitutional ties between Australia and Britain. So, the Australian Act 2 in 1986 ended all the ties between Australia and Britain. Now, another thing to keep in mind is that the name Australia was officially adopted by the continent in the year 1817. That is prior to the gold rush immigration of the European settlers. However, the continent was not new to the human population. It is believed that many years before the European exploration, the continent was already inhabited by the Aboriginals of Australia. Now, the Aboriginals of Australia are the native people of Australia. The native people of Australia, that means that they were the oldest human population that already existed or inhabited the continent before the exploration of the continent by the Europeans. And it is believed that these Aboriginals or the native people living in Australia came from Asia and settled first in the northern portion of continent, from where they eventually spread into the mainland continent. Now let us locate the continent in the world map. So we see that Australia is among the smallest continents that exist on Earth. So as we can see from the very size of the different continents, we can clearly see that Australia definitely is the smallest continent on Earth. Now, besides that, interestingly, Australia is the only continent with one country, and so it is often regarded as the 6th largest country in the world. Now, it being the 6th largest country of the world is twice the size of India. So, Australia, which is the smallest continent on Earth, is also the 6th largest country and twice the size of India. Now, even though Australia is the smallest continent, it has a rich biodiversity. So, let us take a look at the rich biodiversity of the smallest continent, that is Australia. However, before we do that, let me ask you a simple question. Australia is twice the size of which of the following countries? Is it Ghana, or Norway, or India, or is it Canada? Well, the correct answer is India. Australia is twice the size of India. Now let's take an insight of the rich biodiversity of the continent by first swimming with the endangered turtles in the shores of the Great Barrier Reef and enjoy the swim. Now let us hop with the kangaroos and other animals on the Kangaroo Island. Well, the kangaroos are the largest mammal that uses hopping as the only form of locomotion. It is believed that this animal can cover almost 8 meters in a single hop with a speed of 56 km per hour. Kangaroos are regarded as icons of Australia and are around more than the human population of the continent. Now that wasn't enough. Australia also has the relative of kangaroos. Here we are talking about the wallabies. So the wallaby, which is also found in abundance in the continent, is a relative of kangaroo that are around 40 million in number, that is more than the human population. Now besides these wallabies and kangaroos, we also have a very small and harmless creature that lives here. We are talking about the koala bear, where we have these enthusiastic and jolly creatures like the wallabies, the kangaroos and the koala bears. We also have some dangerous reptiles that are found in the continent of Australia. So it is believed that Australia has around 200 known species of snakes. Now, out of these 200 known species of snakes, around 25 of them are regarded potentially deadly, while the rest are still under discovery and research. Now, besides that, the continent is also home to short-beaked echidna that are egg-laying mammals. We also have a relative of ostrich, that is one of the largest living birds on earth, emu. Besides that, we have unique creatures like platypus that are not really found elsewhere in the world. And we also have wild dogs that are dingoes that are found in abundance in the forest of Australia. Now, besides those wild animals, we also have some domestic and commercially valuable animals found in Australia. We are talking about sheep. So, sheep are found in abundance in Australia. There are millions of sheep in Australia, and around 115 million sheep have been recently counted. So, these are domestic animals which are found here, and they have a high commercial value. Now, why exactly the smallest continent on earth has such unique creatures? Now, this is only because of its isolated location. As we can see on the map here, the continent of Australia is far away from the major land masses that dominates the northern hemispheres. We see that Australia lies entirely in the southern hemisphere and also entirely in the eastern hemisphere. So, we see that Australia is a southeastern continent. Now, the exact location of the continent can be understood by marking or taking a look at the latitudinal and longitudinal extent of Australia. So, the smallest continent on earth extends from 112 degree east to 154 degree east longitudes, and also from 10 degrees south to 44 degrees south latitudes. So, that was the longitudinal and latitudinal extent of the continent. We can clearly see that the continent is surrounded by large water bodies like the South Pacific Ocean to its east and the Indian Ocean to its west. Now, besides those large water bodies, the continent is also surrounded by other smaller water bodies like bays, gulfs, and also straits. So, let us take a look at all the water bodies that surrounds the continent of Australia. So, in the very north, the continent is surrounded by the Timor Sea, Gulf of Carpentaria, and the Coral Sea. Now, on the north and eastern portion, we have the South Pacific Ocean. In the southern part, we have the Tasman Sea, the Spencer Gulf, and the Great Australian Bight. And finally, on the northern and southwestern part of the continent, we find the Indian Ocean. So, we see that the continent is surrounded by so many water bodies. Now, what exactly do we mean by the Great Australian Bight? Well, the Great Australian Bight is a shallow bay. A bay is a large shallow water inlet into any landmass. So, here the shallow bay intends into the south and western part or western coastline of the continent. Now, other than that, we also have two important gulfs in the north and in the south respectively. Now, gulfs are just like bays, but they have a narrower mouth, while bays have a wider mouth. On the other hand, so all these water bodies that surrounds the continent rightly justifies the title given to the continent, that is of a island continent. So, due to the presence of water bodies on all sides, Australia is also referred to as an island continent. Now that are we very clear about the location of the continent and saw how all the water bodies surrounding the continent makes it an island continent, we need to take a look at the neighboring countries that are found around the continent of Australia. So, let's start from the very north. So, in the north, we see that East Timor or Timor-Leste, that is an Asian country, is separated from the continent of Australia by the Timor Sea. We also have Indonesia separated from the continent by the Arafura Sea. Now on the northeast portion, we have the Papua New Guinea Islands, and these are separated from the continent by the Torres Strait. Now strait is any narrow water body that separates two land masses and connects two water bodies. So here the Torres Strait is separating the islands of Papua New Guinea by the continent of Australia, while it is connecting two water bodies, that is the Arafura Sea to the Coral Sea. Now other than that, we also have the South Pacific Islands on the north and east part of the continent. These are the Solomon Islands. Other than the Solomon Islands, we also have the islands of New Caledonia, Fiji and Vanuatu. So these are the islands of South Pacific Ocean. And on the southern portion, we see that the Tasman Sea separates the country of New Zealand from Australia. We also see that Tasmania is separated from the mainland Australia by the Bass Strait. So these were the different neighboring countries that surrounds the continent of Australia. So these are the different neighboring countries of the continent of Australia. Now other than those, Australia is also a part of two major island groups. So Australia is a part of Oceania and Australasia. Now what exactly is Oceania? So when we take together the islands of Papua New Guinea, the South Pacific Islands, that is the Solomon, the New Caledonia, Fiji and Vanuatu, and also New Zealand along with Australia, they together form Oceania. However, if we take away the islands of Papua New Guinea, then the rest together make up the Australasia. So Australia is a part of two large island groups, that is Oceania and Australasia. So in this lesson, we were able to understand how the smallest continent on earth was discovered by first the Dutch navigators and finally by Captain James Cook. We also saw how Australia, initially a British dominion, but because of the Australian Act of 1986, it got its independence and all the constitutional ties between Britain and Australia had ended. We further saw the exact location of the continent and saw how the continent has a rich biodiversity, from egg-laying mammals to the turtles in the Great Barrier Reef, and also unique creatures like platypus, koala bears and kangaroos. We further saw that the continent is an island country surrounded by large and small water bodies and have a number of neighboring countries. We finally understood that it is a part of two large island groups, that is Oceania and Australia. In our next lesson, we'll take a look at the political divisions of Australia.